welcome to the channel.
I don't even know where to begin, so I guess I'll just dive in. My name's James. I'm a firefighter, one of those guys who runs toward the flames when everyone else runs away. You'd think that kind of dedication earns you a little loyalty at home, right? I thought so too. Turns out, I was dead wrong. It all started with small things. My wife, Andrea, started acting off. She was glued to her phone, taking calls in hushed tones, stepping out to run errands at odd hours. I chalked it up to stress. She'd been organizing these big charity events for the local school and even one for my department. She always claimed she was just overwhelmed. Then came Matthew, my best friend. We'd been through everything together, training, fires, late-night beers when the world felt too heavy. He was my brother in every way that mattered. I should have seen it sooner. The way Andrea laughed a little too hard at his jokes, the way he suddenly showed up at our place more often than usual, always offering to help out. But the breaking point? That came one Tuesday evening. I'd come home early from a shift, soot-covered, exhausted, but ready to surprise Andrea with her favorite takeout. I walked in, and there they were. Not kissing, not caught in the act, but close, too close. The kind of closeness that screamed intimacy. They froze like deer in headlights, and I knew something was wrong. I confronted them right there, and that's when the lies started rolling out of Andrea's mouth. "You're overreacting," she said. "We were just going over some plans for the fundraiser." Matthew backed her up with a nervous chuckle, saying, "Come on, man. Don't be ridiculous." I wanted to believe them. God help me, I wanted to. But something gnawed at me, a pit in my stomach I couldn't ignore. Later that night, I checked her phone when she wasn't looking. She deleted everything, but one text from Matthew slipped through the cracks. "Can't wait to see you again. Same time tomorrow." It was like a punch to the gut. That's when I knew this wasn't just in my head. Something was seriously wrong. And it wasn't just about the affair, it was the sneaking, the deception. The way they thought I wouldn't notice. I didn't confront them again right away. Instead, I started digging. What I uncovered shook me to my core, but I'll save that for the next post. Let's just say, the betrayal ran far deeper than I ever imagined. The morning after finding that text, I couldn't even look at Andrea. I went through the motions, kissed her cheek, grabbed my gear, and left for the station. But my mind wasn't on the job. It was on that message. On Matthew. On the years of trust that suddenly felt like a cruel joke. I couldn't let it go. That afternoon, I called Claire. She's an old friend of ours, used to date Matthew back when we were younger. They'd had a messy breakup a couple of years back, and we'd lost touch. But something about her came to mind, a gut feeling that she might know something. Claire didn't sound surprised when I told her what was going on. In fact, she sighed like she'd been waiting for this call. "James," she said carefully, "I don't know how to say this, but Matthew's not who you think he is. He wasn't when we were together, and he hasn't changed." Her voice cracked, and I could hear the weight of something she'd been holding back. When we were dating, he had a way of manipulating people. He was charming, sure, but there was always something underneath. I found out he was cheating on me with multiple women. And not just that, he was into some shady stuff too. What kind of shady stuff? I asked, gripping the phone like it might give me answers on its own. "Drugs," she whispered. "Selling, dealing. He used his job as a cover. Said no one would ever suspect a firefighter." My heart dropped. This wasn't the Matthew I thought I knew. But Claire's words started clicking with little things I'd overlooked. Strange conversations Matthew had cut short when I walked in, random people hanging around the station during his shifts. "James," Claire continued, her voice trembling, "I didn't want to say anything because I didn't have proof. But if Andrea's mixed up with him, you need to be careful. He drags people down with him." That night, I couldn't sit still. I waited for Andrea to fall asleep and then went to her laptop. It took a few tries to guess her password, but I got in. My heart pounded as I opened her email, her documents, anything that might give me a clue. And then I found it, a spreadsheet labeled fundraiser expenses. At first, it looked innocent enough. Numbers, dates, amounts. But then I noticed odd entries, thousands of dollars marked as miscellaneous supplies, with no details. Payments to people I didn't recognize. A lot of money flowing in and out, way more than the fundraiser could possibly need. Something wasn't adding up. I copied the file onto a USB drive, my hands shaking. My wife, my best friend, the people I trusted most, they were hiding something. And it was bigger than an affair. The next morning, I called Claire again. I need your help, I said. And for the first time in days, I felt like I wasn't alone in this. What Claire and I uncovered next. That's where things got dark. Claire didn't hesitate when I told her I needed help. She agreed to meet me at a diner we both knew, a little off the beaten path where nobody would think to look for us. I brought the USB drive with Andrea's files, and Claire came armed with a notebook, her laptop, and apparently, a grudge she'd been nursing against Matthew for years. So, Claire said, stirring her coffee, "What's the plan?" I slid the USB across the table. "I don't even know what I'm looking at," I admitted. "But it's shady. The fundraiser money doesn't add up. And if Matthew's involved, I'm guessing it's not just bad math." Claire opened her laptop and plugged in the drive. As she scrolled through the files, her brow furrowed deeper. "James, this isn't just shady. This is criminal." She pointed to a line item labeled, "Fire Safety Equipment, Vendor Payment, for $15,000. Do you have any idea who this vendor is?" I shook my head. "Andrea never mentioned it." "Well, that's because they don't exist," Claire said, pulling up a quick search. "I think they're laundering money. Fake vendors, fake invoices. And look at this, community outreach program. 20 grand out the door last month. But there's no program. It's all bogus." My stomach churned as she pieced it together. Every event Andrea and Matthew had worked on, fundraisers for the school, charity drives for the fire department, they weren't just cover stories for their affair. They were cover stories for something much worse. Claire leaned in, her voice low. "This is textbook money laundering, James. But if what I'm thinking is right, it doesn't stop there." "What do you mean?" I asked. She hesitated, biting her lip. "You said Matthew was dealing drugs. If he's using these events to move money, he might also be using them to move product." It felt like the ground dropped out from under me. All those bake sales, silent auctions, family-friendly BBQs, how many of them were just smoke and mirrors for Matthew's operation? And Andrea, had she known the whole time? Or was she just as deep in this as he was? I clenched my fists, trying to keep it together. "We need proof," I said. "Not just this spreadsheet. Something concrete." Claire nodded. "Agreed. We can't go to the cops with half a story." Over the next few days, Claire and I started digging. She hacked into public records while I scoured every inch of Andrea's and Matthew's social media accounts. We cross-referenced names, traced payments, and compiled a list of people who'd received money from these fundraisers. The deeper we looked, the darker it got. There were ties to local contractors, shell companies, and even a few names that popped up in police reports for drug-related arrests. Claire found records of safety inspections that had been signed off without ever being conducted, inspections for places like schools and community centers. Matthew and Andrea hadn't just betrayed me. They'd betrayed the entire community. And they were putting people's lives at risk. By the end of the week, Claire and I had a stack of evidence that painted a horrifying picture. But we still needed a smoking gun, a way to prove Matthew and Andrea were directly involved. That's when Claire suggested something that made my blood run cold. "You need to confront Andrea," she said. "Catch her off guard. Make her slip up." I hated the idea of it. But she was right. If Andrea was in this as deep as I suspected, she'd crack under pressure. And I needed to hear the truth from her own mouth. That night, I went home, sat Andrea down, and looked her straight in the eye. "We need to talk," I said. Andrea sat across from me at the dining table, her arms crossed. She looked annoyed, not nervous. That stung more than it should have, like my suspicion was just a minor inconvenience to her. "What is it, James?" she asked, her tone clipped. "I'm exhausted." I slid the spreadsheet printout across the table, my hand steady despite the storm in my chest. "Care to explain this?" She glanced at it, then back at me, her face blank. "What am I looking at?" "Fundraiser expenses," I said, leaning forward. 15 grand to a vendor that doesn't exist. 20 grand for a program that doesn't exist. Should I keep going? Andrea's face hardened, but she didn't flinch. "I don't know what you're talking about. I don't handle all the money. There are committees, James. Maybe someone else made a mistake." "A mistake?" I scoffed. "Is that what this is? Just a mix-up? Because if it is, why did you delete all your emails? Why do these numbers match payments to accounts under fake names? Her eyes darted away for a fraction of a second. That was all I needed to confirm she knew exactly what I was talking about. James, she said finally, her voice softening. You're overreacting. This is just fundraiser stuff. You don't understand how much work goes into these things. I slammed my hand on the table, harder than I intended. She jumped and so did I. Don't lie to me, Andrea. This isn't just fundraiser stuff. This is fraud. This is criminal. And Matthew's involved, isn't he? There it was, a flicker of fear in her eyes. She recovered quickly, leaning back in her chair with an exasperated sigh. You've been talking to Claire, haven't you? I should have known she'd fill your head with this nonsense. Nonsense. I shot back, laughing bitterly. Then explain the fake vendors. Explain the safety inspections that were never done. Explain the text messages, Andrea. Don't you dare try to turn this on Claire. Her mask cracked then, just a little. I did what I had to do, she hissed. You think you're so perfect, James? Always working, always the hero. You don't know what it's like to handle everything else. The money, the pressure. Don't, I cut her off, my voice low and shaking. Don't you dare try to justify this. You used my trust, my name, my home as a front for. I couldn't even finish the sentence. My throat tightened, and I clenched my fists to stop my hands from shaking. Andrea stood abruptly, shoving the chair back with a loud scrape. You don't know what you're talking about. And if you keep digging into things that don't concern you, you're going to ruin everything. Is that what you want, James? To destroy everything we've built? Everything we've built? I repeated, standing now too. You mean the lies, the fraud, the drugs? That's what we've built. Her face paled, and I knew I'd hit a nerve. You don't have proof, she said quietly, her voice trembling. I have enough, I said, my voice like steel. And if you don't come clean, Andrea, I'll find the rest. She didn't answer. She just grabbed her purse and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. I stood there, shaking, staring at the door she'd just walked through. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I thought I loved, was a stranger to me now. And I wasn't just angry anymore. I was determined. It was time to go after Matthew. He wouldn't be so easy to rattle, but he'd know the game was up. The next day, I drove to the fire station, heart pounding. I wasn't scheduled to work, but I knew Matthew would be there. It was time to confront him directly. No more second-guessing, no more waiting for proof to fall into my lap. When I walked in, the familiar smell of smoke and sweat greeted me, but it felt different now, tainted. Matthew was in the back, checking the hose reels, acting like everything was normal. The sight of him, so casual, so confident, made my blood boil. Hey man, he said, flashing that same easy grin he always did. But there was something in his eyes, caution maybe. He could sense this wasn't just a friendly visit. We need to talk, I said, my voice steady but low. Now. He glanced around. The station wasn't empty. One or two guys were in the common room, but no one was paying attention. He nodded toward the supply room. All right. As soon as the door shut behind us, I got straight to the point. How long? I asked. His expression didn't change. How long what? I stepped closer, letting the anger I'd been holding back seep into my voice. How long have you been sleeping with my wife? That wiped the smirk off his face. For a moment, he looked genuinely startled, but he recovered quickly. James, come on. You don't really think. Don't lie to me, I snapped, cutting him off. I saw the texts. I know. So, how long? Matthew hesitated, his jaw tightening. Then he shrugged, like it was no big deal. A few months, he said. But it's not what you think. I lunged at him before I even realized what I was doing, shoving him hard against the shelves. The metal clanged, and tools rattled to the floor. Not what I think. I growled. You slept with my wife. And you used my house for your dirty business. Don't even try to downplay this. Calm down, James, he said, his voice sharp but controlled. You're overreacting. Overreacting. I barked. You're running drugs, laundering money, and dragging Andrea into it. You don't get to tell me how to react. He shoved me off, his face darkening. I don't know what Claire's been telling you, but you don't have the full story. You think you're some kind of hero, coming in here accusing me? You don't even know what you're talking about. Then enlighten me, I said, my voice icy. Because all I see is betrayal and lies. Matthew's jaw clenched, and for the first time, he looked cornered. Fine. Yes, there's money moving around. Yes, Andrea and I had a thing. But it's not just me, James. There are bigger people involved. People who don't take kindly to being exposed. You think you're tough, but you're not ready for what's coming if you keep pushing this. The threat hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just about Matthew anymore. He was part of something much larger, much darker. And now I was in their crosshairs. You're telling me to back off? I asked, my voice low and dangerous. You think I'll let this go? Matthew stepped closer, lowering his voice. I'm telling you to think about what you're risking. Your job, your family, your life. Walk away, James. No one has to know about any of this. I stared at him, my fists clenching at my sides. You really think I'm just going to walk away? His smirk returned, colder this time. You should. Trust me. I didn't respond. I just turned and walked out of the room, my mind racing. Matthew had shown his cards. He was scared, but he wasn't going to back down. If anything, he'd double down to protect himself and whoever else he was working with. When I got to my truck, I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. This wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about survival. If Matthew thought I'd walk away, he didn't know me at all. I didn't go home that night. Instead, I called Claire and told her everything Matthew had said. Her response was immediate. James, he's trying to scare you. That means we're getting close. Yeah, but he's right about one thing, I admitted. This isn't just him. There's a bigger operation here. I can't just take him down and call it a day. Claire was quiet for a moment before she said, then we need to make them slip up. If Matthew's scared, he'll make mistakes. But we have to be smart about this. We met at her place, neutral ground where we wouldn't be overheard. She'd already started piecing together more of the puzzle, digging into the fake vendors and following the money trail. It led to some names we didn't recognize but suspected were tied to Matthew's operation. What about Andrea? Claire asked as we sifted through documents. Does she know how deep this goes? She knows enough, I said bitterly. And she's in denial about the rest. Or maybe she doesn't care. Claire nodded, her face hard. Okay. Here's the plan. We make Matthew think the walls are closing in. Force him to panic. I raised an eyebrow. How do we do that? She smiled grimly. We leak just enough to make him sweat. Over the next few days, Claire and I worked on planting breadcrumbs. We made anonymous calls to the school board, raising questions about the fundraiser expenses. Claire sent an email to the fire department's internal affairs team, flagging irregularities in Matthew's inspection reports. Nothing that could be traced back to us, just enough to put Matthew under a microscope. It worked faster than we expected. A few days later, I was at the station when I overheard the captain grilling Matthew about discrepancies in his paperwork. Matthew's face was pale, his usual bravado replaced by a quiet, defensive tone. Just a mistake, he said, laughing nervously. I'll fix it. But his hands were shaking. That night, Andrea came home later than usual. Her face was tight, her eyes darting around like she expected someone to jump out of the shadows. What's going on, James? She asked the moment she walked through the door. What do you mean? I asked, playing dumb. She threw her purse on the table. Matthew's freaking out. He said someone's digging into his records, asking questions. Was it you? I stared at her, my expression cold. And if it was? Her face twisted with anger. You don't know what you're doing. You think you're going to take him down and walk away unscathed? These people. She stopped herself, realizing she'd said too much. These people. I repeated, standing up. Who, Andrea? Who are you so scared of? She looked away, shaking her head. You don't understand, James. If you keep pushing this, you're going to get hurt. Or worse. I stepped closer, my voice low. I already told Matthew, I'm not walking away. So you can either help me or get out of my way. Andrea's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't respond. Instead, she grabbed her purse and left the house again, slamming the door behind her. I stood there in the silence, my anger simmering. Whatever Andrea was hiding, it was bigger than just Matthew's operation. And now I was certain, she was in this deeper than I'd thought. The next step was clear. If Andrea wouldn't talk, I'd have to make Matthew's other connections do the talking. It was time to bring someone else into the fold, someone who could help me unravel this web before it was too late. The more I dug, the more it became clear, I couldn't do this alone. Matthew wasn't just a rogue firefighter running a side hustle. His connections went deeper than I imagined, and the more I exposed, the more dangerous it got. Claire and I were pushing him, but we needed someone with teeth to keep us from being swallowed whole. That's when I thought of Carl. Carl was an investigator for the county's fraud division. We'd crossed paths once during a fundraiser, back when I still thought those events were about helping the community. He'd struck me as sharp, the kind of guy who could sniff out a lie from a mile away. Most importantly, he wasn't tied to the fire department or the school board, so he didn't have any reason to look the other way. I reached out to him under the guise of needing advice about department finances. It wasn't a lie exactly, just not the whole truth. We met at a coffee shop, and after some small talk, I laid it all out. "Look, Carl, I don't have concrete proof of everything yet, but something's not right," I said, sliding him copies of the spreadsheets Claire and I had compiled. "The fundraisers, the inspections, it's all tied to Matthew and my wife. I think they're laundering money, and there's a drug angle I can't pin down yet." Carl raised an eyebrow as he flipped through the papers. "This is significant," he said slowly. "You're sure about the drug connection?" "Not yet," I admitted. But Matthew admitted there are bigger players involved. "He's scared, Carl." "He wouldn't be if it was just him and Andrea." Carl leaned back in his chair, studying me. "If I start digging into this, I'll need more than spreadsheets and gut feelings. You have names, accounts, anything actionable?" I hesitated. "Not yet. But I know where to look." He sighed, rubbing his temples. "James, I get that you want to take these people down. But you need to be careful. If what you're saying is true, this isn't just a small-town scam. You're poking a very dangerous bear." "Trust me, I know," I said grimly. "But I can't let this go. Not when I know what's at stake." Carl nodded slowly. "All right. I'll see what I can find. But you need to tread carefully. Don't confront anyone directly, not until we have enough to bring the hammer down." I agreed, but we both knew that was easier said than done. That night, I couldn't sleep. Andrea hadn't come home, and part of me was glad. Every time I saw her, I felt that mix of anger and heartbreak all over again. I kept replaying my conversation with Carl in my head, wondering if I'd just dragged him into something that would put a target on his back too. Around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We need to talk. Come alone. Matthew's not who you think he is." I stared at the screen, my heart racing. It didn't say who it was, but I had a feeling. I typed back quickly, asking who it was, but there was no reply. Instead, another text came through. "Behind the hardware store. 15 minutes. Don't bring anyone." I debated for a moment. Every rational part of me screamed that this was a trap. But if it wasn't? This could be the break I needed. Grabbing my jacket, I headed out, texting Claire to let her know where I was going. "If I don't check in after an hour," I wrote, "call the cops." When I pulled up behind the hardware store, the parking lot was empty except for a single car with its lights off. I parked a few spaces away and stepped out, my hand instinctively brushing the small pocket knife I kept on my keychain. The driver's door opened, and a figure stepped out, a woman, her face obscured by a hood. As she got closer, I recognized her. It was Marcy, one of the moms from the school fundraiser committee. "Marcy?" I asked, confused. "What's going on?" She looked around nervously before shoving a folder into my hands. "I don't have long," she whispered. "Matthew's been using the fundraisers to move cash and drugs. I didn't know at first, I swear. But when I found out, he threatened me, said if I told anyone I'd regret it." "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, opening the folder. Inside were copies of bank statements, email exchanges, and even photos of what looked like drugs being loaded into a van during a fundraiser event. "Because he's spiraling," Marcy said, her voice trembling. "He's making mistakes. If you don't stop him soon, someone's going to get hurt." Before I could ask more, she turned and hurried back to her car, disappearing into the night. I stood there, clutching the folder, my mind racing. Matthew's operation was bigger than I'd thought, and now I had proof. But Marcy's warning echoed in my head. If Matthew was spiraling, It wasn't just his operation that was at risk. It was everyone around him, including me. The folder Marcy handed me was explosive. It detailed payments from shell companies to real accounts, photos of drugs being stashed at school events, and emails between Matthew and unknown contacts coordinating deliveries. It was enough to blow everything wide open, but it also painted a terrifying picture of just how deep this went. I drove straight to Claire's house, barely able to keep my hands steady on the wheel. When she opened the door, her eyes widened at the sight of me. "James? What happened?" I shoved the folder into her hands, pacing as she flipped through it. "Marcy," I said quickly. "She met me behind the hardware store. She's been helping Matthew, but now she's scared. She gave me this." Claire scanned the papers, her face growing pale. "This isn't just shady," she muttered. "This is a full-blown operation. Look, these emails. These aren't just small-town players. He's working with suppliers." "Suppliers?" I repeated, my stomach twisting. Claire pointed to a name that came up repeatedly in the emails: Rico. She pulled out her laptop and started searching. Within minutes, her face darkened. "This guy," she said, turning the screen toward me. "Ricardo Torres. Convicted trafficker. Got out of prison 2 years ago. If Matthew's working with him." She didn't need to finish the sentence. My phone buzzed again, another text from the unknown number. "You've been warned. Drop it." I showed Claire, my jaw tightening. "They know I'm on to them." Claire's face was unreadable, but I could see the concern in her eyes. "This isn't just about exposing Matthew anymore, James. These people won't let you walk away if you get too close." I sat down, the weight of it all crashing over me. "What do we do, Claire? We can't go to the cops yet. We don't have enough to take them all down. We build a case," she said firmly. "We get everything we can, money trails, emails, witnesses. And when we're ready, we drop it all at once. On the cops, the feds, everyone." "And if Matthew finds out before we're ready?" I asked. Claire hesitated. "Then we make sure he doesn't see it coming." The next few days were a blur of strategy and paranoia. Claire and I worked around the clock, connecting dots and gathering evidence. Carl, the investigator, quietly started looking into the financial records Marcy had provided, confirming that the money was flowing through fake accounts tied to Matthew. Meanwhile, I kept up appearances at the fire station, pretending I wasn't unraveling a criminal network involving my best friend and wife. Every shift, I felt Matthew's eyes on me, like he was waiting for me to slip up. Then, everything boiled over. It was a Friday night when Andrea showed up at the house unexpectedly. I hadn't seen her in days, and she looked disheveled, her usual confidence replaced by something raw and desperate. "We need to talk," she said, stepping inside before I could say no. I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "About what? The affair? The fraud? The drugs? Take your pick, Andrea." She flinched but didn't back down. "You're making this worse," she snapped. "Matthew told me you're digging into things you shouldn't. Do you have any idea what kind of people you're messing with?" "I know exactly who I'm messing with," I shot back. "You think I'm scared of Matthew? Of his supplier? They should be scared of me." Andrea's face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked more like the woman I married than the stranger she'd become. "James," she said softly, "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I didn't know what I was getting into." "Spare me," I said coldly. "You had plenty of chances to come clean. You made your choice. Now I'm making mine." "What does that mean?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It means I'm taking Matthew down," I said. "And if you're smart, you'll get out of the way." Andrea stared at me, her eyes filling with tears. But I didn't have time for her regret. Whatever she was feeling, it wasn't enough to undo the damage she'd done. She left without another word, and I watched her walk down the driveway, her shoulders slumped. For a brief moment, I felt a pang of guilt. But it was quickly replaced by resolve. The storm was coming, and I wasn't going to back down. The fallout from Andrea's visit was immediate. The next day, Matthew didn't show up to the fire station, which was unheard of for him. Instead, I got a call from the captain saying he'd taken an emergency leave. My gut told me it wasn't a coincidence. Claire and I met that evening to reassess. We spread everything we had, papers, emails, photos, across her dining table. The picture was damning, but it wasn't enough to ensure everyone involved would be taken down. We needed something that tied Matthew directly to Ricardo Torres, the trafficker Claire had uncovered. Carl called while we were working. "I've been following a trail from one of the fake vendors," he said. "It leads to a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It's listed as a storage facility, but the financials don't add up. A lot of cash is moving through there." Claire's eyes lit up. "That could be it, their stash or distribution point." "What do you want me to do?" Carl asked. "Can you get a warrant?" I asked. He hesitated. "Not without more proof. But I can put feelers out, see if I can track any activity around the place." "Do it," I said. After the call, Claire looked at me, her expression unreadable. "You're not thinking of going there yourself, are you?" I didn't answer. "You're insane," she said, reading my silence. "You have no idea what you'll find there." "All the more reason to go," I said. "If I wait, they might clear everything out. I need to see what they're hiding." Claire shook her head, exasperated. "Fine. But I'm coming with you." That night, Claire and I drove out to the warehouse. It was in a desolate industrial park, surrounded by chain-link fences and silence. The only sign of life was a single car parked outside. We stayed low, creeping around the back. Claire had brought a small camera to document anything we found. My heart pounded as we approached the side of the building, sticking close to the shadows. Through a dusty window, we could see a few figures inside. They were moving boxes, large, heavy ones. In the corner of the room, I spotted something that made my blood run cold, a duffel bag with the fire department's logo on it. "That's it," Claire whispered, snapping photos. "That's the proof." I was about to pull back when one of the men turned toward the window. His face was partially hidden by a cap, but I recognized him immediately. "Matthew. What the hell is he doing here?" Claire hissed. I didn't answer. My mind was racing. Matthew wasn't just involved, he was running the operation. And from the way he was directing the others, it was clear he wasn't just a pawn in this game. Claire tugged on my arm. "We've got enough. Let's go before they see us." But as we turned to leave, the crunch of gravel stopped us in our tracks. A flashlight beam swept across the lot, landing just feet from where we were crouched. "Who's there?" a voice barked. We froze, holding our breath. The beam moved closer, and I felt Claire grip my arm tightly. If we were caught, it was game over, not just for us, but for the entire case. The seconds stretched into eternity as the beam swept past us and then moved away. Whoever it was must have decided we were just shadows. We waited until the car outside started up and drove off before slipping back to the truck. My hands were shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, but Claire's voice brought me back to reality. "We got it, James," she said firmly. "Now we just have to play this smart." I nodded, but my gut told me this wasn't over. Matthew had to know someone was closing in. And if he suspected me? The storm wasn't coming anymore. It was here. The morning after the warehouse, I woke to find a note taped to my truck's windshield. The paper was simple, the message chilling. "Stay out of it." No name, no signature, but I didn't need one. Matthew was sending a warning. I called Claire immediately. "They know we were there," I said, pacing in my driveway. "Then we're closer than we thought," she replied. "But this is dangerous now, James. You need to be careful." That day, Carl confirmed the warehouse was a hub. A delivery had gone out hours after we left, likely clearing out any traceable evidence. "They're spooked," Carl said. "Whatever they're moving, it's big." Meanwhile, Matthew was still laying low. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. Andrea was also radio silent, something I wasn't sure was a blessing or a curse. That evening, Claire and I finalized our plan. She would package the evidence we had into a timeline, highlighting Matthew's connections to the operation. Carl agreed to forward it to a contact in federal law enforcement. "We need to force them to act," Claire said. "If Matthew feels cornered, he might slip up. And if he doesn't?" I asked. Her silence said everything. By the end of the week, news broke that a local school board member was arrested for embezzlement. It wasn't directly tied to Matthew, but I recognized the name from the fundraiser emails. "They're cleaning house," Claire said grimly, "trying to cover their tracks." But Matthew couldn't cover everything. The pressure was mounting, and every move he made was being watched. For the first time in weeks, I felt hope. It wouldn't be long now. The school board arrest lit a fire under the investigation. Carl's federal contact began quietly digging into the warehouse and the money trail, confirming that the operation stretched well beyond our small town. Meanwhile, Claire and I kept watching Matthew, waiting for his next move. It came faster than we expected. I was at the station when Matthew walked in, looking like he hadn't slept in days. His usual arrogance was gone, replaced by tension. He didn't even glance at me, heading straight to the captain's office and closing the door. 15 minutes later, he stormed out, his face tight. I didn't approach him, but my gut told me he knew something was unraveling. Later that day, I got a text from Andrea. Matthew says you've been asking questions. Stop before it's too late. I didn't reply. That evening, Claire called me, her voice urgent. Carl just flagged a payment from one of the shell accounts, she said. It's a big one, hundreds of thousands, wired overseas. Someone's trying to cash out. Matthew? I asked. Could be. But if he's pulling the plug, it means he's running out of time. The only question was whether he'd go quietly, or if he'd make a last-ditch effort to tie up loose ends. 2 days later, Matthew sent a message to my work phone. Meet me. Alone. 10 p.m. at the training lot. I forwarded it to Claire and Carl immediately. This could be it, Claire said. He might try to scare you, or worse. You sure about this? I wasn't. But if Matthew wanted to talk, I needed to hear what he had to say. That night, I parked at the empty training lot, my truck's engine rumbling as I waited. A few minutes later, Matthew pulled up in his SUV. He stepped out, looking more haggard than ever. You just couldn't leave it alone, could you? He said, walking toward me. You've got one chance to explain yourself, I said, standing firm. What's really going on, Matthew? He shook his head, laughing bitterly. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? You don't know what you're up against. Then tell me, I said, my voice sharp. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're the one who's scared. His face darkened, and for a moment, I thought he might lash out. But instead, he stepped closer, lowering his voice. You think taking me down will fix anything, he hissed. These people don't care about you, your wife, or this town. If you push this, they'll come for you, and they won't stop. Let them come, I shot back. But you? You're done, Matthew. I'll make sure of it. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to his SUV. As he drove off, I stood there, adrenaline coursing through me. Matthew was scared, but he wasn't giving up. After the meeting, the tension ramped up. Matthew's warning echoed in my head, but it only strengthened my resolve. Claire and I decided it was time to bring in Carl's federal contact fully. The evidence we had was enough to trigger action, but it meant things would escalate fast, and dangerously. The next morning, I found a small box on my doorstep. My chest tightened as I opened it. Inside was a firefighter's badge, mine. It was bent and scorched, as if someone had pulled it from a fire. No note. No message. Just a silent, chilling warning. I called Claire immediately. They're trying to scare me, I said. And it's working, isn't it? She replied. Her voice softened. James, they're getting desperate. That means we're close. But you need to be careful. That day, Carl confirmed he'd sent everything to the feds. They're prepping to move, he said. But it'll take a few days to coordinate. Can you hold out? I didn't have a choice. That night, I kept the lights off and stayed alert. Around midnight, I heard the faint crunch of gravel outside. Peeking through the blinds, I saw a shadow moving near my truck. Grabbing my phone, I dialed 911 but didn't hit call yet. Instead, I stepped outside, flashlight in hand. Who's there? I called, my voice firm. The shadow froze. Then a figure stepped into the faint glow of the porch light. My heart dropped. It was Andrea. What the hell are you doing? I demanded, my grip tightening on the flashlight. She looked frazzled, her eyes darting around like she expected someone else to appear. I had to see you, she said. They're watching you, James. Watching us. Who's they? I pressed, stepping closer. Matthew's people, she whispered. He's losing control, and they think you're the reason. If you don't stop, they'll. Before she could finish, headlights flashed down the street. Andrea's eyes widened in panic. I can't be here, she said, turning to leave. Andrea, wait. I called, but she was already running into the night. The car slowed as it passed my house but didn't stop. I stayed on the porch, my heart racing. Inside, I locked the door and sat at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of it all. Andrea's warning wasn't new, but her desperation was. Whatever was coming, it felt closer than ever. All I could do now was prepare for the storm, and hope we were ready. Andrea's visit rattled me, but it also confirmed something I'd suspected. Matthew was losing control of his operation. Desperation was creeping in, and desperate people make mistakes. That was what Claire, Carl, and I were counting on. The next day, Carl called with an update. "The feds are moving sooner than expected," he said. "They've been watching the warehouse. There's a delivery scheduled for tonight. They want to catch them in the act." This was it, the moment we'd been building toward. But Carl had one warning. "James, stay out of it. Let them handle it. If you show up, you'll put the whole operation at risk." I agreed, but my gut told me it wouldn't be that simple. That evening, I stayed glued to my phone, waiting for Carl to call with news. Claire was on edge too, texting me updates she'd heard through her contacts. Around 10 p.m., the message came, "They're moving in." The minutes dragged by like hours. Then, just after midnight, Carl called. "They got most of them," he said, his voice tense. The warehouse was loaded with product, and they arrested several key players. "Most of them?" I asked, my stomach sinking. "Matthew wasn't there," Carl admitted. "He slipped through before they arrived. But they found documents tying him directly to the operation. He won't get far." My relief was tempered by the realization that Matthew was still out there, and he knew exactly who had helped bring his operation down. The next morning, Andrea called me. For the first time in weeks, her voice was calm, almost resigned. "Matthew knows it's over," she said. "He's furious. He thinks I sold him out." "Did you?" I asked bluntly. She hesitated. "I didn't have to. You did enough on your own." Her words stung, but I didn't have time to dwell on them. "Where is he now?" I asked. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "But be careful, James. If he's desperate, he might." A loud crash cut her off, followed by the sound of muffled shouting. "Andrea!" I yelled, gripping the phone tightly. "Andrea!" The line went dead. I stood there, heart pounding, the silence ringing in my ears. Whatever was happening, it wasn't over, not by a long shot. I called Carl immediately, explaining what had happened. "We'll find her," he said, his voice firm. "But you need to stay out of this, James. Let us handle it." But staying out of it wasn't an option anymore. Matthew was on the run, Andrea was missing, and the danger was closer than ever. The next move was clear. I had to find Matthew before he found me. With Andrea missing, I had no choice but to act. Claire traced a lead to a cabin in the woods, an old hideout tied to one of Matthew's past associates. It was a long shot, but it was the only one we had. When I arrived, I spotted Matthew through the window. He was pacing, yelling into his phone. Then I saw Andrea, tied to a chair, scared but alive. My heart pounded as I sent a quick text to Claire with my location. "Found them. Call Carl." But I couldn't wait. I knocked on the cabin door. Matthew answered, gun in hand. His eyes burned with anger. "You should have walked away," he hissed. "Let her go, Matthew," I said, stepping inside slowly. "This is over." "It's not over until I say it is," he snapped. I kept him talking, inching closer to Andrea. My plan wasn't perfect, but I just needed to buy enough time, for her, and for the help I hoped was on the way. Inside the cabin, I kept Matthew talking, inching closer to Andrea. The tension snapped when the door burst open. Federal agents swarmed in, shouting commands. Matthew spun, gun in hand, but he didn't shoot. He froze, then dropped the weapon, glaring at me as they cuffed him. "You think this is over?" he hissed. Andrea was freed, rushing into my arms, shaking but unharmed. As they dragged Matthew out, I knew his operation was finished. Matthew's arrest led to the collapse of the entire network. Andrea cooperated with authorities, but the damage between us was irreparable. I turned my focus to rebuilding, stronger, wiser, and free from their betrayal.
Bye.